All right, welcome. I am standing between you and lunch, so hopefully this will be interesting, and thanks for coming. I wanted to talk about interoperability because I think it's something that easily gets lost in the world of JavaScript. A quick, brief bit about myself. My name is Dylan Shimon. I'm the co-founder of a JavaScript toolkit or framework known as Dojo, which has been around since 2004. Started writing my first lines of JavaScript in 1996, so that's 22 years. So some of you are probably a bit younger than my JavaScript years. That's cool. I was pretty much stubborn and stupid and foolish to start writing JavaScript at that early age. But I saw the promise of the web as this sort of platform where you could do anything immediately. And that sort of instant gratification and that quick reload and refresh and being able to deploy things quickly to anyone was kind of what got me hooked. I dropped out of chemistry grad school to start SitePen, and then a few years later started working on Dojo. And so the reason I mention all that isn't because it's cool, but just because it shows like I've looked at JavaScript for a long time. I've seen many iterations of the language itself, of frameworks, toolkits, libraries, things come, things go, and inevitably a lot of it's all the same. The challenge we have is a lack of interoperability that makes it possible to say, you know, I like React and I like Angular, I'd love to use them together, but they're so big that I can't realistically do that, or they're so different that I can't do that. So this talk's sort of about what can we do to get to a world where it's not a battle for which framework we use or which approach we use, and sort of my thoughts around that. So last year we wrote a 250-page blog series looking at frameworks, and the goal was not to tell you what framework to use, it was to tell you all the questions you should ask about frameworks. And it wasn't necessarily this list of frameworks, but the idea was that choosing frameworks is often like choosing music. You know, you might choose it because they've got a hit song that you like, or someone told you it was nice, or it was cool. And that's not really how we should think about technology and what we choose. We should choose things that align nicely with what we're trying to do. There are a lot of trends that I observe in the world of JavaScript. And some of these are new, and some of these are not so new. But obviously, functional programming and reactive systems and virtual DOM approaches and state management and async patterns are kind of all tied together in what has been popularized since React became popular in the JavaScript realm. But also, they're a big part of what we can do now that we could not do with ES3 and even ES5 implementations in old versions of IE. Transpilers have become big, whether it's Babel or TypeScript, and they're probably the most empowering thing we've ever had in the JavaScript ecosystem. Because before, we would read about a nice new feature and be like, OK, that's cool, but in 5 years I'll be able to use it. And today we can write modern, imperative, stylish JavaScript and transpile it back to the version we have to support. Progressive web apps are becoming big, and it itself is kind of a collection of standards or approaches to help make web applications, especially on mobile devices, feel as efficient and powerful as native applications. The web has kind of, since its infancy, been at war with proprietary solutions. So back in '96, JavaScript was interesting, but Java applets were all the rage. And then it was like the Shockwave plugin, and then Flash and Flex and Silverlight, and today it's native mobile apps are sort of the enemy of the web. Though they're not really, because there's sort of this spectrum from pure web to pure native, but a lot of apps in the middle are sort of a mixture of web and native. But what's really changed in the past 15 years or so is the way we focus on standards. So in the past, the standards bodies were you'd pay a lot of money to be on a body, there were a few members, and you would decide behind closed doors what was going to become part of the next standard. And today our standards are very iterative and very open and very rapid, which is both challenging but also very empowering, but also leads to possibilities for standardization and better interoperability. Our tooling's improved a lot, and one trend that I really want to see more of is sort of going evergreen by default, meaning instead of making every user pay the performance cost of supporting IE11, just make your IE11 users pay that cost. So it's kind of the inverse of progressive enhancement that we used to focus on. So to me, because the standards process is mostly fixed, the best approach to interoperability is to align with standards, whether you're a framework, whether you're just writing vanilla JavaScript. and following those patterns and understanding them. And that's not always easy because sometimes standards are developed by different people and they're not quite consistent or they don't quite work the way you want. How many here are happy with the ES6 class standard? I mean, like, I'm happy it's there, but are you happy with all the features in it? Right, so like probably everyone's hand went down. Like it's nice to have this starting point, but if you actually want classes that do more than just being syntactic sugar for prototype-based inheritance, they're not really giving you what you want, and that's okay, right? But it also leaves a lot of challenges where we can align with the class spec, but now we're not really getting all the things we want from classes. ES 2015 is really nice. I mean, pretty much every framework or toolkit out there rewrote itself, Dojo included, but because it was this biggest set of changes in 20 years with JavaScript, so I don't think I need to say much about that. I'm a big fan of TypeScript. A lot of people are fans of TypeScript. A lot of people don't like TypeScript, and I think that's okay. I think TypeScript's probably the most misunderstood thing by a lot of people because it's like, oh, I'm bringing Java types to the language. And no, you're actually bringing a set of development tools that make your code more accurate that all get removed at runtime. And some of those tools are code features or language features. But most of it is just stuff to help you write better code and help your IDE support you better. But the single biggest thing it introduces that's missing from JavaScript is interfaces, which themselves are a form of a type. So I remember years ago, I don't know if John David Dalton's in the room, he's here at the conference, but he's the creator of Lodash. And Lodash was originally designed to be a better form of underscore. And he, for years, worked to make Lodash support the exact same API as underscore, which was a complete challenge because there was no interface definition for what Lodash and underscore was supposed to do. If he'd had a TypeScript interface describing the API, he could have much more easily conformed to that interface and ensured interoperability and compatibility. So I think, and the problem is, you can't really effectively describe an interface if you don't have a type system to describe an interface. And it's also why I think TypeScript is a bit better than Flow. But so you could argue interfaces are a necessary thing, but they're only there if you're using TypeScript. So it's kind of something that I think is holding us back from true interoperability. Obviously, pretty much every framework out there today uses reactivity. Everyone has kind of understood this. The big question people ask is, why didn't we do this before? And the answer is Internet Explorer 6 through 8. If you tried to do something like a virtual DOM system and react to changes, you would have consumed all the memory immediately in your browser that was available in terms of the number of objects that were allowed to be allocated to a web application, and you would have pushed your application immediately into garbage collection mode. So IE9 is kind of the birth of the virtual DOM being a viable thing for a full-page application. But there were earlier attempts at doing virtual DOM type stuff on a smaller scale. There was Bespin, which was basically led to Cloud9, the code editor, and it used a canvas-based editing approach early on that was essentially virtualizing the DOM for how code got rendered. In the Dojo world, we had an SVG, Canvas, VML, and Silverlight abstraction system for drawing vector graphics, which it itself also abstracted away the DOM. But it didn't do it on this like nice, clean, reactive style architecture that we take for granted today. The HTML5 I can never remember what WICG stands for, but I always remember like 5 minutes after my talk. So, but it's basically a web interoperability compatibility group. Anyway, whatever. This is a group or a pair of groups that are basically saying, what do we need baseline in HTML5 to make things better? So one of the big things is web components, or the custom element part of web components specifically, which is I want to create a tag, and I want to register it, and I want to bind some JavaScript to it and use it. Some APIs that are coming along are things that are finally attempting to standardize common patterns or behaviors we do. So an intersection observer helps you do things like virtual scrolling lists as well as data grids, because they help you determine, is this thing in view of this box or not? And if not, maybe I don't render that content. Web animations, focus, CSS next, those are all pretty straightforward. Those are all things that help us go towards an interoperable stack. So to me, like the three biggest things, that there are dozens of other things that matter, are web components, modules, and having a flexible architecture. So web components allow us to say, my team wrote this component in this one framework and I want to use it in another framework. Can I do that efficiently? And obviously, the framework supporting that creation of that web component has to be small enough for that to be realistic. The world of not having a module system in JavaScript has driven me nuts since '96. We're finally pretty much there. There's a few things we still need to get done and get shipped for that to be reality. But for years, it was, am I using CommonJS modules or AMD modules? Or am I using UMD modules, which route both of those? And neither of those were native modules, and that didn't support all the nice things you get with the new import system. And then just having an architecture that's generally flexible and conforms to an interface makes it possible to actually create things that are interoperable and reusable. So from a standards perspective, probably the 5 most important things to me today for interoperability are modules, classes, asynchronous patterns, custom elements, and progressive web apps. Now, async patterns is something where I complained to the Node people for years because they didn't support promises until very late. And the number of promise implementations in Node was in the hundreds, if not thousands, right? And then you would go to use multiple packages, and they'd have different promise implementations. You were paying the cost of that progressively. So when you see something as fundamental as, I need an asynchronous API that's easy to work with, it's really important to get that built in. We're at a point today where JavaScript modules via script tag are quite easy. Everything except Edge supports them natively, so you can use them in a browser even without something like Webpack if you want to. And custom elements, Edge has just announced they're finally making custom elements a priority. Yes, cheers in the front row and in the middle. So hopefully by this time next year, that'll all be green, and maybe IE will finally die, but we can all dream, right? So I think I've said hopefully IE could die since at least 2005 in conference talks. And just the numbers changed, right? But we're really, really close, so we'll get there. So then there are a lot of patterns where we might have better interoperability than we have today. So interfaces being one of them. But rendering, I mean, pretty much every modern framework now has a function called render. And they all pretty much do roughly the same thing, which is they render a component. So it'd be nice to maybe finally standardize that if possible, or at least create something more interoperable there. There are a million different ways to do routing. I don't know if that'll ever be standardized, but there are a number of good APIs that make that easier. Managing state and reactivity is still something where I think we're kind of experimenting and figuring out the right pure way or the one best way to do that. And I think that's OK. And then there's a lot of work right now around performance optimizations. My former co-founder of Dojo, Alex Russell, he is widely known on Twitter for complaining about, you've got a 2G phone and your app's slow. And my joke back to him always is, why won't Google buy you a better phone? But his point is really that he's trying to make the web accessible and usable for everyone, including those with really slow connections in the middle of nowhere, and that's great. But right now, performance optimizations, I mean, it's a lot of work to make things fast and make things work right. So when I look at the needs of a modern developer, and because I'm a framework person, what needs does the framework need to provide to make modern applications? I want something that's really efficient, provides really nice developer ergonomics. I want something that's going to last a long time, something that's interoperable, and something that's focused, not trying to be the end-all framework for everyone. So when I talk to someone for the first time and they're like, I love Angular, or I love React, or I love this, I'm like, well, what do you hate about it? If the answer is nothing, or the other question would be, what is that framework bad at? What problems does it not solve, right? Then I feel like you're kind of losing the point of the problem, which is no one thing can be the perfect solution for everything. So I wanted to look at a few things that get a bit less attention, just to sort of look at how they're working on interoperability. And first one I picked is Ionic, in part because of their work on Stencil, which is a web component compiler for other frameworks. So they've done work to make it so if you create a React component, it can be included as a web component. If you do something with Angular, it can be included as a web component. And their focus for Ionic 4 is everything's a PWA out of the box, all the components are web components, and they're trying to support a lot of modern standards, which to me makes a lot of sense. Svelte is this other newer framework that's pretty cool. And they describe themselves as the magic disappearing UI framework. And the idea is you use this framework to author code, but in runtime or in production, there's really no framework code left. It's just all attempting to generate modern standards, aligned code. Dojo, obviously, I work on that a bit. I've been working on it for 14 years now, though I do less coding now because I have a big team. But What we've done that I think is really nice is we've looked at like every modern standard that makes sense and found a nice way to support it in a reactive architecture. So it's a lot like React in its fundamentals, but we've looked at things where React frustrates us or doesn't feel consistent. The biggest example I can give is there are times in React where you need a reference to a raw DOM node. Maybe it's a focus event, maybe it's an intersection observer or a web animation. So we've looked at all those use cases and we provided all of those scenarios as properties you can react to rather than having to say, all right, I give up, give me the DOM node, to sort of keep you in that consistent architecture. And to me, consistency is the best way to reach interoperability. If something works the way you expect it to work all the time and you're not having to sort of make a million decisions about everything, you lead towards a path of interoperability faster. This other project I was reading about recently called Project Evergreen. And it's not really a framework so much as it's like Create React App, but for Evergreen applications. So it's a bunch of documentation and information on how to create applications out of the box that are focused on using modern standards and aligning to them. So it's a pretty cool resource as well. The other area that we're kind of getting some nice improvements to interoperability are various things that TC39 is working on. And I raise a few of these just because I think they're interesting and because you may not have heard of them. So a recent proposal is called the standard library. And the idea is to basically build in a module called standard or something like that that you can import and that you can start to include features that are typically only available from toolkits or libraries or frameworks that are built into all the browsers, so you're not having to pay the cost to download them, that are standardized, but then they're also extensible. So the problem with like the math objects in JavaScript is that they might not do everything you want. So then you want to extend them, but you cannot extend them. So then you end up writing your own math implementation and so forth. Another API that's pretty cool, so the extensible web manifesto that came out about 7 or 8 years ago was to say, let's focus on making everything in the web extensible and introspectable, and let's focus on lower level APIs. And lower level APIs are great, but eventually you need to build something that builds on top of other APIs to make it easier to work with. So the idea behind the layered APIs approach is to come up with standards that make it possible to define standards that live on top of other standards more efficiently. And the two examples that they've proposed so far are a virtual scroller web component, which basically builds on top of intersection observer and some other modern APIs, and then asynchronous local storage, which builds on the top of local storage as an API plus the async patterns that have been added to the language since local storage was standardized. So that's one of the problems we have as a standards process is we build all these little pieces, but then we need them to come together to build something bigger. Modules, like while the ES6 module standard is complete and implemented everywhere, there are a few pieces that are needed, and this, to be honest, caused me a lot of frustration about 5 years ago because I was an early proponent of AMD, and while I never thought AMD was the end-all standard for modules, it did a lot of things dynamically that weren't possible with ES modules. So these two things kind of fix the things that we're missing with the module format. One is to be able to dynamically import something. So the idea is, based on this condition, I want to import this or I want to import that. Or maybe I don't want to import something. And ES modules, by default, were defined that the top-level modules can be statically analyzed, so you can build up a dependency tree more efficiently, which is an admirable goal. But sometimes you really need to say, I only want to load this if I need it based on this condition. The other is the mapping of package names. So the ES module format assumes that the place you find your modules is exactly where they live in a file tree, which is fine. But sometimes you might want to say, hey, in testing, I want to remap this package with a mock of this object so that I can test it independent of the real implementation. Or maybe I want to be able to pull a package from some resource that's outside my normal file tree, and I can map that to a URL. But maybe that's only true in certain cases. So these are two really important standards that are part of the TC39 process that I think will make modules complete, or at least completer, so we can have better interoperability. So far, Safari and Chrome have support for the dynamic module syntax, and Edge and Firefox are working on them. So kind of the whole point of interoperability is to stop creating silos. When I started Dojo, we had this ambitious goal. We had two goals. Make JavaScript development real. At that point, JavaScript was, I'd go into and talk to someone and say, oh, you do JavaScript. They're like, oh, Java? Which was kind of funny. And Oddly enough, a couple weeks ago, I heard someone say, oh, I do Java, and someone said to them, oh, is that JavaScript? So like the world's flipped, right? It's great. But the point of that was we started Dojo to make it easier to write JavaScript code, and we added a whole bunch of features that are now standardized, like modules and asynchronous patterns and build systems and so forth. But we also did it, we wanted to collaborate with people. And we thought, well, this will be great. We'll all work together and create one amazing framework. And all that did was led to a million other frameworks being formed. So that we didn't win on that goal, but that's OK. But the idea is if we have a good standards process and we align to those standards, then we can build frameworks that are small and nimble because they're just light shims on top of the standards that are there, rather than being a whole siloed ecosystem that pulls you in and forces you to become a React developer or an Angular developer instead of a JavaScript developer. So there isn't one single solution for all scenarios, so the assumption that I can just use one framework or one approach and that'll be my whole career, while that might be nice, that's not the end-all answer. But if we can align to standards and use things that align to those standards, then we're in better shape. So I work with SitePen. I'm one of the founders and the CEO. And we do a lot of work with JavaScript. We've been around since 2000. And we are also the main people behind Dojo and Intern, which is a framework for testing. But we don't focus just on those things. We focus on helping people be productive with JavaScript. For fun, we create a card game called Milestone Mayhem, and the 3 best questions will receive a copy of the game if you want it. So it's a card game that mimics software development and encapsulates the mayhem that happens during development projects. We also run a podcast called TalkScript that is more fun, less serious, but we interview a lot of fun people. There's a really nice episode with the TypeScript team from TSConf earlier this year. And the first question, we basically asked Anders Heilsberg what his Spirit programming language is. So it's really, really serious stuff. But thanks. Cool. I kept it quick so you could get to lunch faster, so that's good. But if you have questions, shout them out, or I guess there's a mic, but I don't know if we're supposed to use it or not. Or if everyone wants to eat, that's totally fine too. OK, over there.
I can talk really loudly.
Perfect.
Yesterday there was the NPM talk where he predicted that React is going to take off and we really don't need custom elements. Which custom elements are the standards? So where do you see those two things happening where new developers are kind of picking up React and don't really see the need for building individual components?
So the early adoption of web components is primarily around, I want to embed a component into another site. Like, I want to embed a map in a page, right? Or I want to embed an image viewer in a page. And that model really makes sense. And web components are really optimized for that. But I still think that long term, it's a really bad idea to bet against standards, no matter how de facto and how popular they are. And what we've done with Dojo is we've created something that's very much like React, but they're also web components. And you can import web components and use them in a reactive way, or you can export web components, and there's a configuration file that maps the attributes to the properties that get passed into your component. So I think it's a bit of a cop-out to say that React can't support web components and can't align with the standard. Now, the standard itself is not perfect. Where it struggles is, hey, I've got a whole bunch of components in a page. Do I really have to include the framework for each component? Or I want to pass data consistently across all these different components. What's the right approach for that? And so in many ways, the challenge with web components is they've tried to not be a framework, but you really need a framework to use components together. So I'm terrible at predicting history. I just know that in general, I don't bet against the platform. I generally bet against things that are proprietary. No matter how popular they are, they might not prove to be the right solution in the long term. Yeah.
So I think I'd buy your idea that you shouldn't be creating these things in pockets that standardize. But I would argue that maybe it's that competition that is kind of created innovation. Right?
Sure. Yep. So I think in the history of JavaScript, there's always been 3 or 4 popular choices at any given time. And so, in 2004 or 5, it was Prototype versus Dojo versus like isomorphic. In 2006, jQuery came out, and it became popular. In 2009, I think that's when Angular was introduced, and it became fairly popular because it was announced by Google. In 2013, React came out, right? And there have been, I'm skipping over many other frameworks along the way, and that competition is great. But the competition should be on what's new and innovative, not on like what should be standard and what should be interoperable, right? So like we shouldn't be competing on modules or interfaces or things like that. Those should just be built in. And one of the biggest frustrations when Angular 2 came out with people was there's this whole ng module thing that was different than the module system that was part of ES6. And at the time they were using like I don't remember, System.js to load modules instead of making it work with Webpack and ES modules. And so it was like really strange that there was this new standard they could have aligned with, but it took them a couple more releases to really get that story right. Similarly, there's been an issue open for React to make it work properly with web components for like 3 years. And honestly, it's like a 50-line patch that other people have that you can make web components work fine in a React application. But they haven't landed it because it potentially breaks a couple of edge cases that they've supported for a long time. And so there's legitimate reasons why they haven't broken down and just supported web components. But you're not going to standardize on like that new crazy thing. Like right now, I mean, I'm actually amazed that WebVR is as far along as it is because it's a fairly innovative new thing, and you wouldn't expect the standard to be progressing as quickly as it is, which is a testament to like the standards bodies themselves right now are a huge collaboration. I mean, TC39 has hundreds of people contributing to it. And back when I started, the ECMA working group had like 4 representatives. So we do get a lot of collaboration that we didn't get before.
You're saying once you go try things by yourself, but once they have traction, instead of furthering them in our own framework, we should pull back.
I mean, if something is seriously flawed or imperfect, I mean, you can look at like XML HTTP requests. People were unhappy with it for years, and finally we have Fetch, which is a replacement for it. But for years, Dojo and jQuery and others had their own implementations that did more and were better. And in fact, the Dojo request is a lot like Fetch in its API signature. So I don't think it's wrong to extend things. But at the same time, if that extension is going to break or silo your framework from everything else, I think that's a bad thing. Now, if you look at React, like there are many other virtual DOM systems that support JSX syntax. There's the hyperscript syntax that most virtual DOM systems support, which is basically the same as React.create subclass. So there's already a lot of interoperability, even though those aren't standards, they're sort of de facto standards. Some things get standardized, some things people just agree on, and some things people will never agree on. And so the idea is to try to minimize the last group. Yeah?
I have a question more about interoperability between progressive web apps and web. So one of the reasons people are choosing things like React is that they want to like React Native,
Sure.
which allows you to develop native field. What are your thoughts about that thing? Because it looks like it's very similar in elegant, but
Yeah, that's a whole 30-minute talk to talk about mobile app interoperability. But I mean, you sort of have like pure native, pure web, progressive web app, like PhoneGap and Cordova, the Ionic capacitor, which is kind of like PhoneGap but can go a little bit more native. And then you have React Native and NativeScript. And React Native and NativeScript still run a lot of code in JavaScript. It's just using the JavaScript engine, but then they transpile a lot of stuff to native code. The beauty of things like that is you're still writing web code. You're using your JavaScript skills to create native code. I feel like JavaScript should eventually be as fast and efficient as native code on a mobile device. But until we get there, things like React Native are a great way to get there. But what's interesting is people have created React Native Web, which takes the React Native APIs to create web applications, which to me is interesting. And what they're saying is like the React for the web normally doesn't abstract away the DOM enough, but I want the APIs that feel more familiar to a mobile developer to create web applications. So some people argue that like the web is a browser. To me, the web is a set of open APIs that rely on things like JavaScript and HTML and HTTP and CSS that can be used in a full spectrum from like web applications to native applications wrapped in a shell to apps that are converted to native on the desktop, things like Electron, but even probably half the apps on your Mac. At some point, the renderer is HTML with Safari, even though you think like you look at Slack or you look at iChat or you look at other apps, the web is really good at rendering content. And so even those native apps often use web content to render them. So I don't know that there's like a perfect answer so much as it's like a spectrum of choice. I think we're out of time. That was 3 great questions. There's 3 decks of cards. I also have some stickers up here with Dojo on them if you want. Thanks for coming.